Hello, everyone. My name is Donnie Arthur. I'm a fisheries biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game Division of Sportfish. And today I'm going to talk to you about the basics of coho salmon fishing here in Alaska, with a focus on South Central Alaska. I always look forward to this time of year, as coho are one of my favorite salmon species to target due to their aggressive nature. For some of you, this may be the last opportunity to harvest some salmon and put some meat in the freezer. For other of you, maybe you're trying to round out the 5 salmon family challenge, and coho is the last salmon species you need. Regardless of your reason to get out and fish during the late summer and early fall, coho salmon season can be very fun and very productive. So I want to start out by working towards proper identification of coho salmon, as coho salmon are often mixed in with other species, including chums, pinks, and even some lake king salmon. So it's very good to know and understand your proper identification of the species. For some of you, you may come across bright ocean phase adults in the saltwater, or bright ocean or adult phase coho in the freshwater as they first enter saltwater. Later in the season, into the fall, and even into early winter, you may encounter coho in their late spawning phase here pictured below. So how do we identify coho salmon? There are some really good tall tail signs that you have caught a coho salmon based on some identification features. To start, their gum line is white and they have a gray mouth. And that is in contrast to, say, a Chinook salmon that has a black mouth, black gums. Coho salmon have dorsal spotting, meaning they have spots on their back. They also have spots on the top of half of their tail. Typically, they don't have spots on the lower half. Coho also have a wide caudal peduncle. A feature that's often overlooked in coho are the silver streaks in the tail. It's a silver shine in their tail filaments. And for me, whenever I'm working with really bright mixed bags of salmon species, this silver streak can actually be a tall tail sign that I have a coho versus, say, a chum or a very, very bright pink. So amongst all these features, these are great ways to tell that you have a coho, to identify a coho. So I think one way to make yourself a better coho fisherman is to understand the biology of coho salmon. So to start, after they come out of the gravel, they've hatched from an egg and they're an alvin, they come out of the gravel as a fry. Coho typically spend anywhere from 0 to 3 years in freshwater as a fry or par. And then after that fry or par stage, they go through smoltification and then migrate to the saltwater. What's really neat about coho salmon is they only spend about 1 to 1.5 years in saltwater before they return. As elsewhere, it's like, say, in Washington, they may spend 2 years in saltwater or more, but typically in Alaska, we're looking at about a 1 to 1.5 year ocean life cycle for coho salmon. What makes that so fascinating is that they obtain incredible growth, incredible size in just 1 year of ocean feeding. Coho in Alaska can range from anywhere from 3 pounds to, we've seen coho in excess of 20 pounds. And they can put that growth on in a matter of a year and a half to a year and a half in salt water. And most of their growth, about 95% of the growth, occurs in the last 3 months while they're at sea. This makes them amongst the fastest growing salmon species, faster than even king salmon. So before we hit the water, one of the first things we should do is get familiar with the regulations. Here I have pictured the South Central regulation booklet for 2020. If you're going to fish in any other area, say southeast, there's a corresponding regulation booklet for that area. If you're going to fish north, say in the Fairbanks area on the Tanana, that would be the Northern Alaska regulation booklet. And if you're going to fish out west, say Bristol Bay or Kodiak, there is a Western Alaska regulation summary booklet as well. For this presentation, for ease, I'm going to use South Central as an example to 1, read the regs, and 2, help share some regs for the area. So to start, we're going to work in the Susitna River drainage. Just as an example, it's a very popular coho fishery within South Central. So we're going to use this as a great example. So we're going to start in what is the general regulations for the Susitna River Drainage Unit 2. This corresponds to the east side of the Susitna that is mainly accessible, road accessible by the park's highway. So when you are going into these booklets, you start with your general area regulations. And so here we are in the Sioux River Unit 2. And so coho are often found in the regulation booklets under other salmon. And other salmon refers to basically other salmon species other than king salmon. So this would include your sockeye, your chum, pink, and coho. But what you have to be careful is that you have to look at these regs specifically because there are sometimes specific regs to coho salmon. So I'm going to go ahead and magnify this other salmon section within the regulation booklet. And here we can see that we have in other lakes and ponds and all flowing waters, we have a bag limit of 3 per day and 3 possession. But if you notice there, it's 2 per day and 2 possession may be coho. So once again, I want to reiterate that there's sometimes in these other salmon regulations, coho specific regs. So make sure you look at those before you go out fishing. Another thing to notice here is that a coho salmon, 16 inches longer, may not be removed from the water. And if it is removed from the water, it must be retained. If you're not going to retain it, you must release it to the water immediately. So make sure if you're going to be practicing catch and release, or if you don't intend on keeping a coho, make sure that you don't remove them from the water. This can get you in some trouble if you don't. All right, so the next thing to look at would be then your methods and means for the area. Now this is important because we all have a tackle box that has a various array of tackle that has single hooks, multiple hooks, bait, and such. So how do you know what to use? So the first place to look is within your general area is look at the methods and means. And I'm going to go ahead and blow this area up, this section up. And here it is. And so we can see in Unit 2, they have it broken down, tackle restrictions broken down by periods of time. So right now we're in the midst of August. And so we will start with there. So between July 14th and August 31st in the Southcentral River Drainage Unit 2, as an example, you can use bait and multiple hooks are allowed. And then if you notice, that changes September 1st and goes all the way into May of the following year, that only one unbaited single hook, artificial lure, or fly may be used. So it's very important to pay close attention to these methods and means. There will be a corresponding method and means section for any area that you decide to fish, no matter what regulation booklet. So make sure you look there as well as your other salmon daily bag limit. So then the next step in the regulation booklet is to look at your specific area for specific special regulations. And so I'm going to use Montana Creek as an example within the Southcentral River Drainage Unit 2, because once again, this is a very popular coho and other salmon fishery. So here we have Montana Creek, and going down, we can see those July 14th to August 31st, that bait and multiple hooks are allowed, but only up to the park's highway. So there's a special regulation on Montana Creek about the methods and means. And then once again, September 1st, it goes to one unbaited single hook artificial lure or fly. Another thing to notice is within the special regulations, it might have specific areas that are open or closed to salmon fishing or coho fishing. And in the case of Montana Creek, upstream of ADF&G markers located a half-mile above the park's highway, it is closed year-round to salmon fishing. So in theory, you would not be able to coho salmon fish above that marker. And so once again, you need to look at the specific regulations for the area you intend to fish. I'm just using here Montana Creek as an example. And then lastly, before you go out, you always want to check for emergency orders. And so these can be found at our Alaska Department of Fish and Game website. And you can search by area and region and area. And so right here we have the Matsu one, and we can already see at the top of the list, for example, there's a little Sioux River sport fishery restriction on bait. Actually, bait is prohibited. And so you would only know this if you had checked the emergency orders, because the regulation booklets would have the general regulations. And so the EOs trump what's in the regulations. So always make sure you check these out before you go fishing. So now let's move on to the good stuff. We've gotten through the regs. We want to keep you guys out of trouble and help you get on the river and fish and have a good time. So here is some run timing for South Central specifically. If you're interested in other regions, I recommend calling your area regional or area office. You can call, if you're interior, call Fairbanks, or if you're in Glen Allen area, there's a Glen Allen office, and so on and so forth. I'm going to work once again, focus on South Central, just as I'm based out of the Anchorage office. So here's some run timing for Coho and South Central. We've got some major areas within South Central, so the Mat-Su, Kenai River, Kenai Peninsula, so on and so forth. What you can notice is that Coho start to show up to the area starting in June. In some areas in specific, see some early Coho in June. For example, Seward can see Coho as early as the second week of June out in the saltwater. And we have seen and caught Coho in Ship Creek, for example, in the Anchorage Bowl, in the third and fourth week of June. But for the most part, we don't start to see Coho really come into the area heavily until July. And the runs, for the most part, peak in August. August is really a great month to target Coho. Some areas have longer protracted runs. Some areas haven't even have a second run of Coho, like for example, the Kenai, and this really makes that run long and drawn out. For example, in the Kenai River, it's really incredible. There are believed to be Coho in the Kenai sometimes more than 10 months of the year. That's a really long drawn out run with 2 peaks in the run. However, there's some regulations on when you can target and harvest Kenai River Coho. So make sure you check the regs for those. But it just goes to show that Coho have a very protracted run timing, and there are specific run timings to each river and drainage. But for the most part, August is the month for Coho. So we are in the midst of some of the best Coho fishing we'll see all year. All right, so I want to start. We have an idea of run timing. I want to go over some techniques that you could use for targeting Coho. And what's really awesome is, like I mentioned before, Coho grow so fast out in the saltwater in 1 year, and that makes them so aggressive, whether they're in the salt or even after they've returned and made their freshwater migration. This can make them really aggressive and easy to target with a variety of techniques. So I'm going to go over some really popular, really effective techniques that we use here for Coho in South Central. To start, I want to start with cured salmon roe. In freshwater, it's arguably the most popular technique. However, there's some things to consider with this technique. So I want to go over some pros with this. It's deadly effective. If you have a large school of Coho, especially unharassed Coho, salmon eggs, they're very likely to take to salmon eggs. There's many ways to present it. You could do it under a bobber. You can dead drift it without a bobber. You could even use a spin and glow and rest it on the bottom and fish for Coho that way, like you would for Chinook. It can, depending on where you're at and what other species are around, you could reduce catches of other species. You can really focus on those Coho. Coho really take to eggs much more than any other species. And so if there are pinks around, you may be able to get through some of those pinks and pull the Coho out, rather than if you were to use other techniques where pinks may be more apt to bite, like a vibrax or a fly. There's some cons to this technique though. Not all waters are open to bait, and bait can be restricted by EO, like we just saw in that little Sioux emergency order I just showed for an example. And so you got to be on your toes and watch the regs and watch for EOs whenever you're planning on using bait. It can be very messy too. It's cured in salt and dyes and oils. It can stain clothes, can stain your hands. So it's very important to maintain a clean space, wash your hands, wear gloves. There's effective ways to get around that drawback to using cured salmon roe. But another drawback is that it catches non-target resident species like dolly varden and trout, which can be very detrimental to those species as they are gorging on other salmon eggs and salmon flesh, and so they may actually be apt to take those hooks and your salmon roe very deep. So if you find yourself fishing for Coho and catching a lot of other species like dolly varden and rainbow trout, I would recommend trying a different technique to just minimize your bycatch of those species. What's great about cured salmon roe is it's readily available. It's available at most tackle stores. Many grocery stores carry salmon roe, so it's very easy to come by. And there's many companies of store-bought roe, and some are good, some are okay, and some are excellent. And some will be more effective than others. And so finding that roe you really like, and quality can vary. Seasonally, I've noticed with store-bought salmon roe, sometimes maybe they were curing chum eggs or they're curing sockeye eggs, and so that I've found that can have an effect on the effectiveness of the eggs. I think the best way to go about it though is home curing your own roe. I've found that most home cured roe is better than most store-bought roe. So if you have the opportunity, you've harvested maybe some sockeye earlier in the season, you've got a lot of eggs, I highly recommend curing those up to have on hand for coho season. Just like tying your own flies or doing something, making your own spinners and catching fish on it. Catching fish on your own home cured roe can be really gratifying. And you can get really creative. You can add all different types of dyes and scents and oils, and change the color. I've fished blue and purple roe before, and it can be effective. So it can be a lot of fun. Once again, though, very messy. Not just fishing it, but actually the curing process can be very messy. Here's a classic recipe that I often start with, and if someone's looking to explore to do their own roe, and they don't want to start with, because you can buy shakers of cure at the store. There's all sorts of companies that make it, and it just comes already with the premixed ingredients, dyes, and you just dry your eggs and sprinkle on your eggs and let them refrigerate and cure in that salt brine as it pulls the liquid out of the egg skies. But I like this, if you really want to get into it and get creative, you can start with a very simple recipe and build up from there and get creative. And what I do is equal parts sugar, equal parts salt, equal part borax. And then I mix in either Jello or Kool-Aid of desired color. So if I wanted red, maybe I'll use a cherry Kool-Aid. Or if I wanted orange, I could use orange Jello package. And that can give the eggs some color. And then I'll add a few drops. You want to be very conservative because oils tend to be a little intense. A few drops of herring oil or krill oil. Krill and shrimp oil are really good for coho. Part of their diet in the ocean, so that oil can actually be really effective when you put it in your salmon roe recipes. So give it a try. It can be really great. It can be really deadly when you have your own cured roe. So once you've cured your roe, or maybe you've purchased store-bought roe, either method's fine. How do you present it? How do you present these eggs to effectively fish or coho? And so there's a couple ways to do it. And so there's the bobber and egg method. There's bottom bouncing, and there's spin and glow on the bottom. And so I'm going to focus primarily on the bobber and eggs and bottom bouncing methods, as I typically do these more for coho. And once in a while I'll fish spin and glow, but I usually save that for Chinook season. I like to mix it up a little bit. I do a lot of spin and glow on the bottom for Chinook. And so I like to fish a different technique for coho, just to mix it up and try something different. And fishing it with a bobber and eggs can be a lot of fun, especially when the fishing's hot and your bobber's just disappearing all the time. So for any of these techniques, you'll need to learn the egg loop knot. It is a critical knot. Any other way of putting your knots on, other than maybe if you used a mesh, use egg mesh, but you can't just take roe and just put the hook through your eggs. More not likely than not, you're going to cast, and those eggs are going to cast off. This egg loop was developed to get around that problem. It secures your small amount of eggs on the back side of the hook. And Fish and Game has actually developed a great video on how to learn to tie that knot. And that's featured right here in this PowerPoint. We can make sure we share that link with this video at the end of the presentation. And learning that knot can be really, really great, because you can learn to tie it for a single hook. If you're fishing an area that only is you're allowed to use bait, but you're only allowed to use one hook. Or if you're allowed to use multiple hooks, you can tie a 2-hook egg rig. And that's really great, because what you could do is you can put your eggs on the front hook, and your back trailer hook will be help your effective hookup rate with those coho. You're more likely to stick those fish with that second hook. And so this video goes over the basics of tying that egg loop knot. Now you can buy pre-tied leaders with egg loops. Some come with doubles, some come with singles. So make sure you pay attention to which one you're buying, and make sure you check the regs that you're allowed to A, use bait, but B, how many hooks you're allowed to use, 1 or 2. And so here's a basic schematic for doing the bobber and eggs technique. So I typically use a slip bobber, and what that means is the bobber is free to slide up and down my line. And then those slip bobbers come with a stop knot, which is basically a piece of a rope thread that you put on your line, and that can slide up and down, and you cinch it tight to your line. And so your bobber will slide up and stop on that bobber stop knot. And what that's really great for is if you want to fish 2 feet deep, then you can have your knot set to be 2 feet. Now, if you want to fish a really deep hole, say 10, 15 feet deep, then you slide that knot all the way up, but you're not casting 15 feet of line. You're only casting your short bit of leader with the bobber. So it allows you to fish really deep holes without having to cast enormous lengths of line. So those slip bobbers are really great and give you a lot of adjustability. Now, once you've casted, you'll have some weight underneath your slip float, and so that's what's going to cause your float to rise up and your leader to sink down. And you want your eggs to be just above the bottom, because that's where the fish are running. They're running right against the bottom. Some fish will come up and strike eggs that are suspended and stuff, but you want to be right off the bottom. You don't want to be dragging bottom, because you're bound to hang up, snag up, and lose your rig. So you want to be just off it. That is the perfect place to be. And then so below your slip float, you'll have some weights to get that down. You have a swivel that goes then to your leader with your egg loop knot and a small amount of eggs. Your egg should be about the size of a quarter, and sometimes small as a dime, maybe even a little bit bigger than a quarter. But I found that a lot of people put a little too much eggs on their hooks. I think a quarter is the perfect amount. Maximum, I would go as the size of a golf ball, but I tend to go a lot smaller for coho, because you'll run through a lot of eggs if you're using golf ball size mountain roe. This is a really deadly technique, especially in slower water or in tidal water when the tide might rise. So this would be a great technique down at Ship Creek, or if you can find if there's a deep hole you want to fish, but you can't, maybe it's 10, 15 feet deep, but you don't want to cast 10, 15 feet a leader, because that'd be a really hard leader to cast. This slip bobber technique is very effective. I highly recommend it. It's probably about 75% of what I catch my coho on in areas that are open to bait. And once again, Fish and Game has developed a video, an excellent video. I highly recommend watching this on this exact setup, the slip bobber and egg setup. And there's a video with the link there. We'll make sure to share that at the end of the presentation. And this goes through all of the basics of rigging it, casting it, and fishing that exact setup. It's incredibly deadly. I recommend having a few slip floats in your arsenal. And you can fish you don't have to fish eggs under a bobber necessarily. You can use that bobber technique and fish it with jigs and flies underneath that bobber as well. But I'll go over some of that in a little bit. Just to show how deadly effective in some places it can be effective at. This one fish here on the left was caught at the mouth of Willow in a mess load of pinks, probably hundreds of pinks, and there were a few coho scattered in. But because we used a bobber and eggs, we were able to weed through those those pinks and really target those coho without having to catch pink after pink. And we were able to increase our catch rate of coho. On the right is one of my favorite places to fish here in town, and that's in Campbell Creek. A very snaggy river, but an effective way to fish that creek is with the slip bobber and eggs. And now I mentioned it earlier, that is a creek you do not want your eggs dragging on the bottom, because you're bound to hang up on snags and sticks and roots. So definitely want to adjust your bobber to be a little shallower in Campbell Creek. So just 2 examples of great places to fish this technique. Another way to present your roe is the same exact setup essentially, but without the bobber, and just have that roe bottom bounce. And this is great when maybe coho are really shy to the splash of a big bobber, or maybe they're shy even to just the weights coming down into the water if the water's super clear or super shallow. So what I'll do for bottom bouncing is either I'll put a few split shots on my leader. You can see in this picture here, I put a few split shot above my leader, and that'll get it down and let those eggs just kind of bounce downriver. In some cases, when it's really shallow and the fish are really spooky, I won't even use those split shot. I'll just drift a leader with eggs and no weight. And the weight of the hooks and the eggs will actually bring it down deep enough in some instances to fish effectively. And one place I found that to be very effective is at Jim Creek and Connect River confluence, which is super shallow, although it's glacial, and so there's not a lot of visibility. Those fish are so shallow, those fish are super spooky. So if you cast anything really big and heavy, those fish seem to spooky scatter, whereas if you shed the weight, just go with some roe and hooks, and just drift that on the bottom, it's pretty effective. And I've actually picked up both coho and sockeye doing that. And make sure you check the regs and EOs for that area, whether you can use bait or multiple hooks when presenting roe that way. So now let's move on to our artificials, our lures, our spinners and spoons, and we'll go over some effective ways to fish these and some good examples of ones that will actually help catch coho. So probably the most popular, widely known lure in Alaska are the Vibraxes, Maps, and Kodiak Customs. These spinners are widely used all over the state. They're deadly effective. They're deadly effective even out in the salt. A lot of time in freshwater when these fish are bright and haven't been harassed at all, they will absolutely obliterate a spinner because they're so aggressive. They're so keen to flash. That's why spinners are really effective. Typically, I fish a Vibrax in a size 3 to 5, a MEPS 4 to 6, or a Kodiak Custom 4 to 6. And that'll depend, the size will really depend on the body of water, how big it is, how deep the fish are, and really how spooked they are. The more spooked they are, the smaller the spinner the smaller I have to go with my spinner. Some great colors, orange, pink are classic. Chartreuse is one of my favorites. And there's all sorts of colorations, color combos. And really, they all work, and they all work at different times. So I always keep a few oddball colors in my tackle box just in case, the classic colors aren't working. So spinners are very effective, very easy to fish. They're not messy like roe. And when bait's banned, you can fish spinners. So spinners are, for the most part, typically allowed. But so have you noticed that some of these lures in this picture have treble hooks? If you're in a water that is a single hook only, you will need to change out that treble to a single hook. What I recommend doing is there's a couple ways to go about that. You can cut off your treble and add what's called a siwash hook. And a siwash hook has an open eye, and all you do is you take off that treble, you put that open-eyed siwash hook on there, which is a single hook, and you pinch the eye down, and now you've turned your Vibrax, Kodiak Custom, Maps, or any other spinner that's out there into a single hook that is legal in single hook only waters. Another effective lure are spoons. What I like about spoons is their castability. They're heavier, they're dense, they tend to be a little denser, compact compared to the same weight spinner, and so they'll tend to cast a little further. However, there's one major drawback. Because they cast further and the way they swim through the water, they tend to actually foul hook other fish that are there. Say, if they're in a school of pinks with some silvers, you may end up foul hooking some pinks. And so I found that they do tend to foul hook other fish often if they're in big pods of schools. But I like, once again, that castability is really nice. So casting offshore, say from in Seward or Valdez or Whittier, where you're casting in the salt water to these fish, a spoon can be a very effective way to cover a lot of water and catch some coho. One of the more popular, widely known lures in Alaska is the Pixie. It is a spoon with a plastic egg insert. And these are very effective. They come in different flashes and different color. I typically fish a 1/2 ounce to a 7/8 ounce, depending on how far I need to cast and how spooked the fish are. So I love the silver Pixie with different color inserts. It's kind of my classic go-to. I always keep one in my pack whenever I'm going fishing. Even if I'm planning on fishing eggs, most of the time I'll always carry a Pixie and or a spoon of some sort and a spinner in my pack. Another great spoon is a crocodile spoon. They tend to be a little pricier, but they're very nice. They are built to not only just cast, but they actually troll really well. And they come in a variety of colors of counter shading, and counter shadings being that they're dark on their back, light on the bottom, and that's kind of the fish camouflage, the way fish camouflage in open water. And so a lot of their spoons are colored that way, and so I find that they're very effective. Once again, these come in big weights, so 1/2 ounce to 2 ounce. So these have a lot of castability. So these can cast really far. I love using these, heavier spoon like this out in the saltwater, like say off Allison Point in Valdez, or off the beach in Seward, or in Homer. And there's tons of colors. There's lots of silver chrome colors. They've got mackerel. I really love the 2-shade blue and silver, or black and silver. It's my 2 favorite. They're very deadly effective. And there, for example, is an Allison Point. Is about a 12-pound silver caught off Allison Point, casting and retrieving a spoon pictured just like this in about a 1.5 ounce size. And so aggressive silver out in the salt can't resist a well-presented, far-casted spoon. So another artificial I'd like to talk about are jigs. Arguably the most underrated coho lure. They're heavy. So a jig has a big, heavy lead head, and then they'll have either plastic or rubber accents as an attractant. That big lead head makes it heavy, and so it gets down and dives quick. And this is really effective in pocket water or really deep holes where coho may be lying or holding. Coho love to hold behind deep holes behind, say, a giant rock, so in an eddy. And that might be hard to present with something that's lighter, or some roe, or try to cast a spinner through. That currents that happen behind those eddies and those big rocks make it difficult, so they'll flutter your spinner and it won't spin correctly, or your spoon will get carried downstream too fast. And so a jig allows you to get into that pocket water behind in that eddy and plop down quick right to where the fish are holding behind those rocks in those deep holes. And they come in a wide variety of colors, everything from bright to drab colors. They come in different materials like marabou, so feathers, rabbit strip, and those give a lot of action. They come in rubber as well, and those rubbers can have twister tails and flukes, and so those can be very deadly for coho. And what's really neat is you can present them on any method. Spinning rod's really great way to present them. I've seen people fish them on a bait caster, and even on a fly rod, casting out a jig and high sticking behind a big rock. You could do that with a fly rod. You can also put a smaller jig under an indicator on a fly rod. So you can use many styles of fishing, could use a jig. You can even cast it under a bobber, and that's a really effective way, because now you've got this heavy jig and a float that you can try and keep behind that rock and fishing and jig it underneath that bobber. So really deadly technique, way underrated for lures. So I highly recommend it, and it's great for coho. And just for example, here's some ways they can be tied: different colors, different materials, rubber legs, no rubber legs, different colored painted jig heads, and even articulated. So once again, these are a great, effective, cheaper way to catch some coho. Keep them in your box. It's a nice way to mix it up. You can always swap out your roe setup under a bobber and do a jig under a bobber. So keep some jigs in your box. And tidal coho that have just come in from the salt are a great way to fish for them is with a jig, actually, especially if they're in some holding water. And you can just trot them and just have that jig up and down through a hole that they're sitting in. And I've noticed that if they're being a little shell shy because there's been a lot of spinners and other lures casted at them, if you go with a thin, darker colored jig, you can get locked jaw coho to bite. So once again, don't underestimate the jig. Now, some of you may be fly anglers or looking for opportunities to catch a coho on the fly. Coho are incredible on the fly. They're acrobatic. They chase down flies. They are aggressive. So they're really a great specimen to target while fly fishing. Here on the left is a coho that was caught on a fly being carefully released. Remember, I mentioned that they can't be removed from the water unless you intend to retain them. And if you do remove them from the water, it's part of your bag limit. In this case, she was releasing a coho and kept it in the water, and that's the proper way to catch and release a coho. Here's another one that was caught in late fall on a fly, and actually while trout fishing, we were fishing trout flies and caught that coho. So it just goes to show, just they're aggressive for flies, and even if you're not targeting them, you're using trout flies, you'll have a coho chase down your fly for sure. So when selecting gear for fly fishing, I recommend a 6 to 8 weight fly rod, anywhere from an 8 to 20 pound leader. And my leader weight depends on a lot of things. It'll depend on the size of the coho I'm targeting. I'm going to fish a lighter weight leader if I'm at a stream that typically has 3 to 5 pounders, versus say the Kenai that I know has well over 10 pounders. So I might fish a little heavier leader on the Kenai. If I have to, once in a while, I'll go 6. If the fish are really shy and the water's very, very clear. But typically I'm between that 8 to 20 pound range. And then I really like a sturdy reel with a sealed drag. Typically when I'm fishing coho on the fly, it's late season on a sandy bar, and I'm catching a decent amount of fish. And so my reel might spend a lot of time on the ground in that sand. And so having that sealed drag just makes it more durable. And there's actually really well-priced sealed drags on the market. And I highly recommend them for coho fishing just based on the nature of where you're fishing for coho. And if you're in some hot fishing, you could be putting your rod and reel in the ground, in the water pretty often. Now with selecting flies, I always look for flash. I look for movement. And so some examples, some great flies, the Dalai Lama, it's kind of got a mix of that movement with a lot of rabbit fur and articulation. And then a classic one is the egg-sucking leech. It's got that egg in the front. It's got some movement. It flutters in the water column as you strip it. So once again, a deadly pattern. These are great patterns to use for coho salmon when targeting them on the fly. And there's two great ways to target or to present a fly to coho. One is the strip. So you cast it out, and then you just strip in the fly. Do a couple, 1-2 strips at a time, and then pause, and then strip again. Coho love that pause. So make sure when you're stripping for them that you take a moment in between a few strips to pause and let that fly sink back down. And then when you bring it back up, it flutters. And a lot of times, but when you go to, after that pause, you go to strip it, and that's when they'll take it. And so make sure you definitely add a pause in there stripping. And then swinging as well. So you can cast it out, the fly out into the current, and then just let the current carry it down. And as it swings, that current will kind of have the action, the flash of that fly flutter and splash in the water, and entices coho to strike. One other way to present a fly actually that isn't presented here is dead drifting. So dead drifting either under an indicator or just dead drifting like you would a nymph. So coho can be a lot of fun on the fly, and these are great ways, techniques, and flies to target them. For example, here is on the right is a coho that I caught on the Kenai River in some froggy, slow water, and it was on a 4-inch long articulated leash, so lots of action. It wasn't super flashy, but it was all about that action, and I was stripping it in, and I hooked it actually on the pause in between a few strips. A really fun, highly coveted way to target coho or silver salmon on the fly is with a wog or poppers. There's a few rare moments that will present themselves when a wog can be used in an effective way to catch them. Typically, when they're pooled up and they're sitting shallow in these giant pools and they're schooled in several dozens to even hundreds, that's a great way to present. It's a great time to present a wog or a popper and send it right through the top of that school. Essentially what a wog and a popper are going to do is they're going to flow right on the surface. They're going to have some action, but they're really going to pop on the surface and make some splash on the surface. And the coho will come up from those holes and annihilate those wogs in the right conditions. A lot of times the first few holding holes above tidal water can be really great places to target coho on the wog or popper. For example, some of the streams on the Copper River Highway in Cordova, those have some holding holes that can hold coho in decent numbers. Then they'll be looking up at wogs and poppers, and so you could present and fish for them that way there. And you'll see it when you're out fishing for trout or you're fishing for coho, say with an indicator, which is a small bobber that's meant to be castable on a fly rod. Sometimes those coho will come up and strike your indicator. If you see that, that's a lot of times. That's when I'll switch onto a wog just to see if I can lure one up to hit on the surface. It's a lot of fun to see them strike. And a lot of times when they hit that walk, they're hitting it and immediately coming out of the water. It's some of the most fun fly fishing you can do for them. But once again, it's a rare opportunity, and if you do ever come across it, take the chance to try and fish them this way. So I'm going to try and kind of transition to some saltwater techniques because we, in South Central, all over the state, Southeast, Kodiak, we start to target coho before they even hit the freshwater. So, I'm going to go over some great saltwater techniques. There's a lot of ways to catch coho and silver salmon in the saltwater. One popular way is called trolling. Trolling is essentially presenting a lure or bait while under motion. So basically you're moving and your lure is moving, and so therefore you're covering some water. It's a great way when you're searching for coho. So you don't know where the large schools are at, you're trying to find coho and other salmon. So you're trying to cover a lot of ground and be effective, and so you're moving so that covering that water can help your odds in intercepting some coho. And so trolling can be done from a variety of vessels, large vessels. Here on the left, I actually was trolling from a kayak and caught that silver. So there's lots of opportunities to troll for them and ways to troll for them. And then the added benefit of trolling is that while you're going to be searching for coho and out there trying to catch coho, you're actually a good chance you're going to catch some other species, say king salmon. And this was one king salmon that we caught while coho fishing out of Seward last August. And you also catch some other species such, I've caught all other species of salmon, including sockeye, chums, and pinks while trolling for silvers. Now when trolling, you got to figure out how you're going to get down. There's a couple ways. Cheaper way, and this is the way I did it from when I kayak fish for coho, is a banana weight. And I would typically use anywhere between an 8-ounce and 16-ounce weight and just paddle on my kayak, and that would get me and my lure going, and my banana weight would get me down. Now you can do that from a large boat as well. Now there's other ways to get down to depth to catch coho in the saltwater, and that would be with a diver. And there's a variety of companies that make divers, and they come in a variety of depths. I've seen as shallow as 10-foot divers, and I've seen over, I think the deepest I've seen is a 150-foot diver. And so these go really deep. They're planers. So basically when you're under power or you're paddling on a boat or you're motoring, the current's going to push on that planer and it's going to dive your lure down, dive your leader and lure to depth. And typically those divers come with instructions on how much line to feed them to get to the proper depth that they're meant to be at. And then another way to do it, a little pricier, but very effective, is a downrigger. And a downrigger is essentially a spool of cable that goes to a giant lead cannonball. And then you clip your line or leader onto that cable via a trigger release. And so you will be under motion. Your cannonball is going to be really heavy, so you're going to be straight down to the depth you want to be at. And if you get a strike, that trigger release is going to release your line, and you're going to be able to fight that coho without any extra weight or drag from, say, a banana weight or a diver. So it's a really nice way to fish for them, just a little pricier. The big upside for them is that if you drop your cannonball down to 90 feet, if you have the proper size cannonball, you can know you're fishing at 90 feet. And so I use about an 8 to 12 pound cannonball, depending on currents and how deep I plan to fish when I'm out. And now when I'm fishing for coho out in the saltwater, I've caught them in 5 feet, and I've caught them down below 150. But typically I'm looking to be anywhere between 10 and 120 feet. And what I'll do is if I have multiple rods on my boat, is I'll have one rod maybe be at 30 feet, another rod at 60, and another rod at 90. Now remember though, you can only fish one rod per person. So I'll have different people's rods dialed into different depths if I'm searching for where the fish are at. But if I catch 3 fish at 30 feet, then I'm going to try and bring all my lures and divers or downriggers down to and be dialed in at 30 feet because I found where I think the fish are swimming at. So when I'm searching, I'll have different depths, and when I've found them, I'll try and stick to that specific depth. So you should also consider when you're picking the way of getting your lure down for trolling, you should consider the drag of a flasher. So flashers are either a sheet of metal with some holographic tape on it, or they come in plastic now in the shape of a cone that are meant to be reduced drag or drag free. And those are meant to be attractors to attract fish from far away to your lure. So consider the drag of a flasher when you are picking your way of getting down. A banana weight's going to really flag out with the drag of a flasher, so you may be shallower than you expect, but on a cannonball, the drag of a flasher is not going to be able to move a 10, 12-pound cannonball on a downrigger. So using a flasher may be better for downrigger use, but maybe not as effective for banana weights. But then also when you're deciding on which way to get down and for trolling, you should consider the cost. Banana weights you can get pretty cheap at any tackle store for a few bucks a weight. Divers tend to range from $8 to $20 a pop, but downriggers can be pretty pricey in the several $100 range. They make some cheaper models out there, and I've actually even heard of people using paracord tied to the cleat of a boat and to a cannonball as a cheap way to make a downrigger. But that you got to consider that you got to be careful of your prop or your lower unit on your boat and just hanging up, because that can be very dangerous to hang up or tie a paracord and a weight to the side of your boat and then hang up on the bottom. So make sure you consider that as well. So when trolling, what lures should you use? How should you fish for coho? There's many ways to do it. A lot of people just troll a whole herring or a cut plug herring, and so that a cut plug herring is a herring that's been cut at an angle, and then the knife is beveled to give it even an angle vertically, but also an angle horizontally. And so what that does is that herring is, as you're trolling, that beveled angle on the herring, that cut plug herring, is going to make it spin in the water. And how aggressive you make that angle on the herring will determine how fast that herring spins. For coho, I like a fast spin on my herring. And I'll even troll a little faster for coho in the 2 to 4 mile an hour range. But coho like things fast, and they'll chase fast baits and fast spinning baits. For kings, I'll actually slow down how fast I troll and the angle of my cut on my herring to slow the roll on my herring for kings, because they're like a little slower. But coho are fast. They're fast feeders. They got to go fast. So they're out there chasing fast baits down, or fast prey down. And so they'll chase down your fast baits and lures. Like I said, 2 to 4 miles an hour is a good speed. And then there's trolling lures. I'm a big fan of trolling lures. They're meant to do exactly what a whole herring and a cut plug herring is meant to do. The only difference is they aren't bait. So what you spend in extra cost of lures, you actually save on the cost of spending on bait. It's also not messy because you don't have the scales and the slime of herring. They also, what I have found is that I catch a lot less pinks if I'm trolling for coho, and there's a mess of pinks out there in the saltwater in, say, Resurrection Bay or Prince William Sound. If I use trolling lures, I tend to catch less pinks and the same amount of coho as I do with a cut plug, but with cut plugs, I'm catching a lot of pinks by catching a lot of pinks. So if you're not interested in weeding through a bunch of pinks, then I would recommend the trolling lures. And there's a couple brands out there, and they come in a cut plug shape and a whole herring shape. So it's meant to be exactly like if you're trolling a normal herring. And some of them actually open up and have a little sponge on the inside that you can put some herring oil on to add a little scent to them. And they come pre-rigged with leaders for the most time as well. So that's something to consider as well, because with a cut plug herring, you'd have to have some leaders and tie up some, either some egg loop with 2 hooks to put through your herring, or they make pre-tied trolling mooching leaders. So another really popular fun technique is called mooching. And this is what I do after I've been trolling for a couple hours and I picked up a few fish here, a few fish there, and then I get into a hot fury of fish. So there's gonna be a lot of fish around. If I maybe catch 3 in a row trolling within 5 minutes, and I know there's a lot of fish down, what I'll do is I'll pull up all my trolling gear and switch things to mooching rigs. And so what a mooching rig is it's basically you're gonna have a weight. Say a banana, you're gonna have a banana weight to a leader with 2 hooks that you're gonna put a piece of herring on. And a lot of people like to put hoochie squidge, which are pictured right here. Some people add the flash skirt in there to add a little flash. And so you can do it with or without the hoochie skirt. And then what you're doing is you're just dropping that bait and squid with your weight down, drop it down to 100 feet, and you're reeling up 30 feet, and you're dropping it down to another 10 and bringing it up 40 and dropping it down 60. And what you're doing is just going up and down, down the water column, and you're trying to really entice those coho and find, get the, entice them to strike and bring them to the surface. And a lot of times as you're working your way to the surface, you can get a decent sized school work to the surface, and you can be catching them right under your boat. But you can do it, you can mooch down to 200 feet and just mooch your way up, mooch your way down. And if you start to find that they're just sitting at 50 feet or maybe they're sitting at 100, you can sit and mooch at those depths. It's a nice thing. There's a lot of adjustability here. That's a really deadly technique, especially when you've already found that big school of fish, maybe via trolling or maybe via your fish finder. Here on the right was actually a 16-pound coho I caught mooching off of Crafton Island in Prince William Sound. And it's a really deadly technique. A lot of people that fish the silver salmon derby in Seward use this technique. It's very effective out in Cook Inlet and Southeast, all over the states. Just incredible technique for catching salmon. And it can be hot and heavy. You can have several silvers coming up from the depths, chasing your mooching rig as you're reeling in. So this is kind of a technique that's probably a little less heard of. It's one that I actually was recently introduced to a few years ago while halibut fishing. It's a herring under a bobber. And you probably, I mean, that's nothing new. That's not rocket science. People have been fishing that for hundreds of years. And, but it's a little different in the sense that you're going to do it deeper. What I do is I'll fish it deeper. What I'll do is without the bobber on my line, I'll drop my herring, just like my hooching rig, but I'll drop a herring on a leader with a banana weight, 1 to 3 ounce banana weight, and I'll drop it down 20, 60 feet. And then I'll clip on your classic red and white bobber that you used to fish as a kid and just let that drift off. And I'll do that maybe we have a group of friends that are mooching right underneath the boat, and I've got to help get fish and net fish in the boat. And so I'll have my bobber drifting off way off in the end of the boat. And I'll just keep an eye on it while I help other people out. Another time I've used it, actually, we were all halibut fishing, and I had gotten my limit of halibut, and so I wanted to fish for something else. And so while everyone else was finishing getting their halibut limit, I threw this bobber on and or dropped my herring, clipped a bobber, red and white bobber on, and let it drift away from the boat. And I was out of everyone's halibut fishing, out of the way of everyone else's halibut fishing, and catching coho. And it's great. And unless you know where the depth of those fish at, it's kind of a bit of a guess how deep you should go. But I think a magic depth somewhere between 30 and 60 feet, 20 if you know they're going to be a little shallower. And it can be a fun technique, just watching that bobber disappear out in the middle of the ocean. And you can do this technique from shore, but what you would do is basically you'd set your depth, maybe to 5 feet, something that's castable, have your bobber clipped on, and just cast out your bobber with a herring underneath it out from shore. You probably wouldn't need as large of a weight if you were to do it from shore. And I've caught both kings and coho in Seward and Homer off the beach doing doing that from shore. But I've just recently got onto this herring under a bobber out in the big open water, out at like Pony Cove and Cheval, and it can be a lot of fun, especially when you've got to be that person on the boat that's netting other people's fish, and you got to be multitasking, because then you can just have that bobber out there fishing. But it's a lot of fun. This picture here on the right was a coho that was caught 3 weeks ago, or 3 or 4 weeks ago out at Cheval Narrows on this exact technique. We were a couple of us were mooching, and Katya here had a herring under the bobber drifting away from the boat, and the fish just like if you were pan fishing back in the States or something, the bobber just started going down and just bloop bloop, and she just set the hook and caught this nice coho, and she actually caught close to a limit just on this technique. So I always have a red and white bobber on my boat now. I just learned this 2 years ago, and it's a lot of fun. So with that, I've covered a lot of techniques, and I guess I want to go over some, maybe not some techniques, but some tips to help you improve your odds of catching a coho. So just some final closing tips here. So first things first, watch the weather. Coho are very susceptible. They'll hunker down. They'll go off the bite if the sun is beating down. It's a hot day. Coho fishing is much better in overcast conditions, even a light drizzle. So I'll typically pick my days to go coho fishing when the weather isn't. When the weather is actually less than ideal. I try not to fish on those really bright, sunny days. So watch the weather and pick your days. It'll definitely impact your success rate. Another thing I do is I watch the stream gauges. So pictured in the last weather photo I had, there was some rain there, and I'll watch for that rain, and after it rains, I'll watch the stream gauge. This is a stream gauge on Campbell Creek. This is from USGS's website. They have several stream gauges all over the state of Alaska. Southeast, interior, south central, southwest, Kodiak. So these are available online for free. And you just watch it. And if you see there's several spikes here, and that's right after a rain. And a lot of times when it rains, it can happen as it can blow out a river to the point where it can't be fished. It's not even safe to fish. But a lot of times what I'll do is I'll fish on the side of it where it just starts to rise from the rain, and it hasn't gotten too dirty or too unsafe or too high to fish. I'll fish it as the water starts to rise, and after it's crested and it stopped raining and the water starts to fall, I'll actually fish as the creeks start to drop after a rain. Because what happens is some of these creek mouths are really shallow, and these coho are just waiting to come in. And they need rain to give them enough water to get maybe over the shallow entrance of a mouth of a creek, and that rain will do it. And so after the rain has fallen, there could be a lot of fresh coho in that creek. So I watch the stream gauges. I watch the weather coupled with the stream gauges. It can be a very powerful tool. If I see the creek start to rise and that staff gauge is starting to spike, I will go. And so just so you know that this represents the flow, this y-axis here. This is how much flow is in the creek. And so I'll watch that. If I see it to start to rise, I'm definitely heading for the water to go catch some coho. Another thing is fish the tides. A lot of these streams, especially in South Central, if you're lower down in them, or creeks like Ship Creek, you are definitely going to need to learn to read the tides and learn how to fish them. So here there's in Alaska, for the most part, most days there are 2 high tides in a day. We are on a diurnal tide cycle. And so what we have is in the blue is we have a rising tide. And basically it takes 6 hours on average, 6 hours to go from low tide to high tide. And in the middle, so 3 hours after the low or 3 hours before the high, is when the water is flooding. It's called the flood tide. And that's when the water is coming in the fastest and the most water is coming all in once. And so I fish the flood because that's a giant wave of tidal energy of water that these coho will be sitting in and riding up the creeks into the mouths for a free ride. It saves them energy that they can save for a further migration upstream. So they're riding on the front of these tides. All right. So then we get to high tide. I don't do well at high tide typically because there's a lot of water in the creeks, like Ship Creek. There's almost too much water. The fish get diluted and they're not in a high density. But once that tide starts to go out, things turn back on. So I fish the incoming, but I also fish the outgoing. And on the outgoing, what happens is those fish either need to commit to going upstream, or they'll go back out. And so you'll actually get a second second attempt at catching the fish that are going back out, or those fish that are coming in that didn't quite make it up initially will really commit to going upstream. So you actually get some fresh fish still even coming in on the outgoing tide. And because there's current now coming out, those fish start to hug the side of the stream, and they're closer in, and there starts to be less water, so the outgoing tide can be very effective. So typically 3 hours before high tide and 3 hours after high tide are some of the greatest time to fish on a tidal system. Fish early in the morning. Coho get shell shocked very quickly. Couple casts of a Vibrax into a whole coho, the bite can shut off for the rest of the day. So being the first person to a hole can be very advantageous. Coho also tend to be more active in the dusk and dawn. And so being out there early can really increase your odds. Here's a coho I caught on Campbell Creek, and I caught right at the park opened at 6 a.m. and I was there 6:05 and catching coho. It might, partly is because of the rain, but it was also too because I had gotten there early and I'd beaten other people to some of my favorite holes. So getting there early, fishing early is very important. Can be very helpful in catching coho. On the Kenai, a lot of those people that fish coho on the Kenai and fishing froggy water will run up to fish those frog water for coho first, get a limit of coho, and then go fish trout for the rest of the day. If you're going to fish multi-species, I recommend going and chasing your coho first, because that morning bite can be excellent. And then the other side is you can wait till the end of the day and try to get them at dusk. And I've definitely had some success that way, but not nearly the success I have early in the morning. My next piece of advice is learn and master the regulations. Now, I don't expect you to tell me every single regulation for the entire state, but learn and master your area. There's huge benefits. You're going to know the regs, you're going to stay out of trouble. But two, it gives you more opportunity to branch out and explore. If you go to Bird Creek and the fishing's slow, like there are several creeks around Bird Creek that you may be able to fish. And if you know the regs or you have a copy of the regs, then you can actually start to branch out a little bit and see that, oh, you can fish California and Glacier Creek and Girdwood and catch some coho there as an alternative. And if the more you branch, the more you know the regs, the more you know you're branching out opportunities. So I've learned Anchorage bull regs very well, and it helps me when I'm out fishing for coho. If my number one stream is not fishing well, I've got a option B, C, D, and I know that I can fish them because I know the regs. So learn, master your regs for your area, and carry a copy with you. It'll keep you out of trouble, and it'll help provide more opportunity. Don't ever overlook slow, froggy water. Currentless water is not always the most fun to fish, but coho that aren't ready to spawn and they're milling, they're fresh, but they're long ways from spawning. A lot of times what they're going to do is they're going to hold in froggy water and mill there for a couple weeks until they're ready to go upstream into their spawning beds. And so don't overlook this froggy water. The coho will pile up in the dozens, even hundreds in the right froggy water. And these are great waters. You want to go stealthy in these water. You don't want to be casting your biggest Vibrax and smacking, your big Vibrax smacking the water. You might go with a smaller Vibrax or a fly that's, a lightweight leech that's not going to make a big splash in this slow froggy water where they're all pulled up. You don't want to spook them in these froggy water, because once the bite's off in these froggy water, it really stays off until probably the next couple days. So you want to be stealthy, you want to be low profile, and you don't want to make big splashes with your lures or your bobbers or such. You want to go lighter weight lures and be a little on the stealthier, quieter side. And then my last tip is adapt and be creative. There's a million ways to catch coho out there. I presented some of them. These aren't the only ways. Throw the kitchen sink at them. They're deadly. You never know. You could come up with a brand new technique for catching coho, as long as it's permitted by the regulations. So once again, check bait and hook regulations. But get creative, adapt, move around. And so bringing all these tips together, knowing your regs, and having some extra different types of lures. I carry casting plugs and diving plugs with me at all times, just to throw something different at them. And I've come out with fish when I didn't think I was going to, because I got creative. At Ship Creek one time, you know, everyone was fishing eggs under a bobber and casting vibraxes, and the bite was just slowing off, and I casted a diving plug, and actually got a limited silvers in 3 casts, and it was just because I got creative. Another time at the Homer Spit Lagoon, the Nick Dudiak Lagoon, people were casting vibraxes and fishing herring and all sorts of other methods, and I decided to cast and retrieve a spin and glow with some roe, and ended up getting a limit, and I got to fish every cast and got my limit. And I've never fished that technique again. I had never before, casting, retrieving, and spin and glow, but it was just to show that if you get creative, sometimes you can get fish when you least expect it. And with that, I conclude my presentation. I appreciate you guys listening along, and I hope you can use some of these tips to either get you started on your first coho adventure, or if you're a pro coho fisherman, I hope I've provided something to help your arsenal or help your toolbox of how to catch coho. Thank you for your time.